to our very first invited public lecture within the so-called Competence Network, Postcolonial Hierarchies in Peace and Conflict, as this is called. It's a collaborative project of the Center for Conflict Studies at the Philipps University in Marburg, so in the lead, and three other institutions. My own one, that's the Arnold Bergstrasse Institute here in Freiburg, the University of Bayreuth and the University of Erfurt. It is an interdisciplinary research initiative funded by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research. The network investigates how historically formed post-colonial hierarchies manifest themselves in contemporary conflict dynamics and what implications this has for sustainable conflict transformation in the future. To do so, the network brings together historical perspectives on the context of conflict formation, in particular those shaped by colonialism, with post-colonial research perspectives, as well as with methodologies and theories of peace and conflict research. Now that just as a kind of a reminder of the framework, but let me now present to you our speaker, Paul Basu. Paul Basu is an anthropologist, curator and critical heritage specialist, and now is Hertz Professor in the transdisciplinary research area Present Pasts at the University of Bonn, a research area denomination that is that fits perfectly to what the Hierarchies Network claims, namely that the colonial past and patterns of domination have lingered on, and that it is high time to overcome Eurocentrism in the study of so many things, in our case, peace and conflict studies. Western knowledge production is indeed questioned in Professor Basu's work. He's both interested in bringing different academic disciplines together, but also to address and include the non-university public. So let me briefly give you some main stations in his career. Professor Basu earned his PhD in anthropology at the University College London. He held professorships at both SOAS and University College London prior to his current appointment in Bonn. He has been principal investigator in many collaborative projects and is the initiator and head of the Re-Entanglements project, which deals with colonial collections in decolonial times, more particularly the collection of the prominent British colonial anthropologist Northcote Whitridge Thomas, so a government-appointed scholar working directly for the colonial administration and focusing on West Africa, particularly Nigeria and Sierra Leone. Currently, he's building up a global heritage lab, quite an ambition, I would say, and Professor Basu has a long publication record, not only on West Africa, but quite a lot on the Scottish diaspora, as I found out. And from this list, I want to select one article in a collection on reclaiming heritage, published by Routledge in 2007, that may link well to our Hierarchies project. It is called Palimpsest's Memoryscapes, Materializing and Mediating War and Peace in Sierra Leone, where our honorable guest looks into the meaning of sites of memory, whether monuments, renamed bridges, or mass graves, and he argues that such sites are also sites of mediation, rather between past and present, and not so much between conflict parties, if I understood this well. But today, he will talk more broadly about colonial heritage and knowledge production in conflict, building on reflections of how one can link up anti-colonial uprisings in the 19th century to the recent civil war in Sierra Leone. Give a warm welcome to our guest, Paul Basu.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome, and many thanks to the organisers of this lecture for the invitation to come, and of course to you for coming along, both here in person in Freiburg and also online via Zoom. So, as we've already heard, this talk has been scheduled alongside the first Think Lab, which is an intriguing concept of a network of international scholars who are coming together to consider how colonial and post-colonial hierarchies affect the dynamics of conflict, of transformative justice, and the consolidation of peace. Today, as I understand, they've begun by reflecting on their key terms of reference. What, for instance, is meant by the terms coloniality, postcoloniality, and decoloniality? What distinct, and perhaps not so distinct, forms of hierarchy arise from these labels? How might a critical understanding of colonial and post-colonial hierarchies produce insights in the field of peace and conflict studies? So I thought I'd try and approach some of these themes from a slightly more oblique direction, and particularly through thinking about these two documents. They are the reports of two commissions published 150 years apart. On the left is the so-called Chalmers Report, published in 1899. This is the report of a British Parliamentary Commission established in the aftermath of, quote, a native insurrection in the newly declared British West African Protectorate of Sierra Leone. The commission was led by a British colonial judge, Sir David Chalmers, hence the Chalmers Report. On the right is the report of the Sierra Leone Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC, which was published in 2004. As with other TRCs, this has been established as an instrument of transitionary justice following the decade-long civil war that engulfed Sierra Leone between 1991 and 2002. Sierra Leone gained independence from Britain in 1961, so ostensibly we can regard the 1898 insurrection, also known as the Hut Tax War, and the Mendi Uprising as a colonial conflict, and the 1991 to 2002 civil war as a post-colonial conflict. As I hope will become evident, however, such linear conceptualizations of time which neatly divide into distinct epochs, such as the pre-colonial, the colonial, post-colonial, already reflect the kinds of hierarchical ways of thinking that this network perhaps seeks to interrogate. And I should say from the outset that unlike many of those involved in the network, I don't come from a political science, public policy, or indeed peace and conflict studies background. As has already been mentioned, I'm an anthropologist who, in part at least, specialises in histories and legacies of colonialism. Much of my work in Sierra Leone and elsewhere in West Africa has involved exploring the interfaces between different memory practices. This involves a constant movement between different sites of memory, for instance, between the colonial archive, physical locales in the landscape, oral accounts of the past, and more performative forms of embodied memory. Just to give you a little sense of the kinds of work that I tend to do. These journeys, as it were, from sites of memory to sites of memory, might begin in the archive and then take me to the landscape, a particular place, a particular group of, a particular community. They might begin with the community or a particular place or a story and perhaps lead me back into archives and so on. Just to give you an example, this is a photograph taken during a punitive expedition, a relatively minor punitive expedition in 1889 to a place called Lago, which was the headquarters of a man called Micaiah, who from the British colonial perspective was regarded as a warlord, a slave raider, someone that had to be subdued. This is in the period before the declaration of the Sierra Leonean Protectorate, when British interests were basically making alliances with local polities, offering them the protection of the British, well, largely the British military. And it comes, of course, in a context of very complex political relations that can't be understood outside of these kind of colonial kind of interferences, as it were. which of course date back hundreds of years by this stage through the period of the transatlantic slave trade and so on. Much of my research, and as I say, it might begin with a photograph like this, which shows the destroyed town, or one of a cluster of towns. In the distance, you might be able to make out another town surrounded by a wall. These were known as war towns, and they were defended kind of settlements. So this was Makaya's town in the foreground, which had been torched in that familiar colonial militaristic way, as a way of destroying Makaya's power. Makaya was still at large at this time. So the kinds of research I do often involve quite detailed archival types of research, with those kinds of photographic sources, with documentary kinds of sources in the colonial archive, piecing together the events of however long ago the events were, through maps and so on. And it's quite challenging because, of course, these maps were not accurately drawn. Settlements and their settlement names tended to move around the landscape and so on. So it involves a kind of quite complex archival exercise. And then what I'll do is I'll bring that material back to the communities themselves. It's a kind of repatriation in a way of knowledge, of histories, but very different kinds of histories in a way. And the accounts that one gets, of course, through collecting oral histories of the same events are rather different. Events remembered in oral traditions are often very different from the accounts in the colonial archive, and it will come as no surprise to any of us that that's the case. But it's these differences that my research has been concerned with. Not only the differences in terms of the kind of accounts of the stories or the histories, the events themselves, but the way in which they're remembered, the medium, if you like, of memory. And this, of course, is also about hierarchies, not only concerning whose voices are attended to and are given priority to, but hierarchies in the forms of which knowledge, hierarchies in the forms in which knowledge is produced and recorded. The photograph, the map, the document, these all have very different evidentiary status. And certainly for many historians, the document is considered a more reliable source than mere oral traditions. Anthropologists generally invert this hierarchy, attending to the anecdotal, the unofficial, the local voices that are usually excluded or peripheralized. And this work, the way in which memory, as it were, is held, and I'll come on to talk about this in a bit more detail later, is also very much part of the landscape. So I showed you that photograph which had these kind of wall fences around this settlement. Well, of course, the traces of these are often in the landscape itself, and people can narrate these landscapes and the events that happened around them in very interesting kinds of ways. I mentioned that I'm no expert in peace and conflict studies. However, I started working in Sierra Leone in the immediate aftermath of the civil war, and I was interested in a similar way to I've been describing these different memory practices that kind of coexisted, and particularly the introduction of new types of memory practices that had been introduced by international organizations. And they brought into kind of, these are organisations that were participating in different forms of transitionary justice initiatives, from disarmament, demobilisation and reintegration, to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, and the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And each of these and many others brought with them different approaches towards memorialisation. Often techniques that have been employed in other kinds of contexts, in other continents even, which introduced approaches which would otherwise have been really quite unthinkable in the Sierra Leonean context. And I have this picture here of the Kama War Memorial, which shows these, the remains of skeletal remains of people, which really is a very alien thing to contemplate in Sierra Leone. And we might think of examples of such memorials in Cambodia, for instance, and elsewhere. So this is kind of internationalization of memory practices associated with transitional justice and so on. And I'm sure it'll have already been said today that these have a kind of colonialness about them, a coloniality in the way in which they come to, as it were, colonize local memoryscapes too. Later, efforts were made to introduce more culturally sensitive approaches, such as the symbolic reparations program funded by Germany. This was implemented in association with local NGOs in an attempt to provide an interface between these international concepts of transitional justice and local cultural practices. Such interventions involved improvised rituals and the erection of memorials, but these too have failed to connect meaningfully with the people they were intended to benefit. In an evaluation by the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt just 3 years after the programme, Eva Ottendorfer reported, and it's a longish quote, when interviewees were asked about the symbolic reparations, they remembered that a feast had taken place and that the whole town had gathered to attend a ceremony. The memorials themselves did not receive any attention. People expressed a lack of understanding as to why the memorials were placed at the centre of the town when the sites of massacres were outside of town. The memorials were used as sites to dry laundry or post advertisements. People were generally unaware of their function. And here's 3 photographs taken from this report, and you can kind of see examples of this here. In the top left there is a kind of a memorial where people used to kind of hang out their laundry to dry. The point's made that the memorials be erected, but there's no plaque. The plaque was never actually put on there to say what this was all about. This one here, bottom left, the memorial actually you can barely see. It's hidden behind a large advertising hoarding advertising the 50th anniversary of independence celebrations. And over here, an example where there is a plaque, but actually if you look at the plaque, at least 60% of the information on the plaque is listing all of the different donors and so on that funded it. No wonder you might think why people are actually so indifferent to these. Meanwhile, in my own research, what I found interesting was the way in which events and experiences from different times overlapped and influenced each other. And the whole environment was a space of memory, not explicitly as in the case of international agencies' attempts to create memorials, which local people quite clearly found rather irrelevant, but in more shifting, informal and implicit ways. The mass graves of civil war were in some sense not exceptional, but rather they overlaid the mass graves of other conflicts. And we see here, sorry, there's something, I wonder if I can remove, dare I remove it? Sorry, what? No, okay, I won't remove it in case something goes wrong with the Zoom, so we can't see this lady's face. This lady's pointing to a mass grave, unmarked mass grave in the town of Falaba, for instance. And Falaba is a settlement that was created, established in the late 18th century as a result of conflict. This was established by Yalunka people who were pushed out of the Fruta Giron area due to the jihad that was happening there in the mid 18th century. And they created, they had various settlements, of course, on their kind of migrations. But they settled eventually in this place, Falaba. And I don't know, again, you can see from this photograph, this ring of trees. And this is actually, the settlement there's this huge ditch dug around the settlement, great banks, and on top of the banks, these stockades were set up using sticks from cotton trees, which actually take root very easily and then grow up to these huge trees. And Falaba was attacked and destroyed various times in the 19th century, including in the so-called Sofa Wars of Samari in the 1880s. And you can see in this photograph, for instance, here, in the aftermath of one of these attacks, the travelling commissioner, George Garrett, again a British kind of agent of British colonialism, visited Falaba and took these photographs where you can see other, well, not mass graves, but the evidence of this conflict. But this sense that conflict, memory, traumatic histories overlay each other, different kinds of ways. And indeed, the whole landscape then is a kind of a sense, a space of memory. And you can see the trees of Falaba still tower over the town, and people all know what these trees are. They're protecting the town. They're regarded as benevolent protectors of the town. But this speaks of this long history of conflicts and so on. Meanwhile, since the end of the most recent conflict, and against a backdrop of continuing political and economic turmoil, Sierra Leone has been beset by other crises, such as the Ebola epidemic of 2014 to 16, and a catastrophic landslide in 2017, and that a consequence of unregulated deforestation and urban development. Interestingly, in casual conversation, and here I'm showing you one of those mass graves associated with the Civil War. This one was erected with the assistance of the Inter-Religious Council, for instance. And on the right hand here, you're seeing the cemetery, the Ebola cemetery in a place called just outside Waterloo, which houses thousands and thousands of Ebola victims. In casual conversation, many Sierra Leoneans conflate these crises, for instance, describing the Ebola epidemic as a continuation of the Civil War. And beyond the loss of life, there were indeed many parallels: the influx of international agencies, the digging of mass graves, the siphoning off of humanitarian aid by corrupt politicians, the remarkable resilience demanded of people in the face of overwhelming adversity, perhaps a fatalistic kind of acceptance. This temporal and mnemonic heterogeneity, apparent in the experiential conflation of different crises, has been observed by anthropologists working in other contexts in Sierra Leone. In her book on memories of the slave trade in the region, Rosalind Shaw uses the phrase palimpsest memories to describe how discursive and embodied memories from different periods become entangled, such that one period is remembered through the lens of another. She argues that people's experiences of the Civil War were layered with tacit memories of the transatlantic slave trade, manifest, for instance, in senses of vulnerability to malevolent presences against which one must protect oneself. Similarly, Marianne Ferme, another anthropologist of Sierra Leone, has observed how new experiences map onto older forces grounded in regional history and culture, and do so on the same terrain. These are not exclusively Sierra Leonean or even West African understandings of the relationship between past and present. It's close in a way to what Michael Rothberg describes as multi-directional memory in relation to the Holocaust. The point I'd like to make here, though, is that the awareness of such complex processes, which shape both what is experienced and the sense that is made of such experiences, did not seem to find its way into the transitional justice mechanisms that I saw being applied in Sierra Leone. And this again relates to questions of hierarchy and coloniality. Linear understandings of temporality and causality are characteristic of a modern Western worldview, but contrary to Eurocentric assumptions, such conceptualizations are not universal. Indeed, as the Argentinian philosopher Walter Mignolo has argued, we need to understand that colonization involved not only the colonization of space and territory, but also the colonization of time and memory. To employ a term coined by another decolonial theorist, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, it is evident that colonization was accompanied by an insidious process of epistemicide. the destruction of other ways of thinking and knowing, other rationalities. Here we can see how power dynamics are not only evident in the conflicts themselves, but also in the processes through which we come to understand the conflicts. It is often the case, for example, that greater value is placed on forms of knowledge produced by external experts, while the voices of those, quote, kind of ordinary people are relegated to the margins. This is an example, this is an illustration from a kind of an outreach pamphlet produced by the Special Court for Sierra Leone. As you can see, a kind of forensic examination of a mass grave going on here. And the caption, investigators find evidence about what actually happened during the conflict. This notion that it's the outside expertise, the experts with their scientific tools, as it were, that have the capacity, the ability to find out what actually happened, rather than the people that experienced these events. One of the key tasks of commissions is to gather evidence from different sources, including sources like this, but including also oral testimonies and witness statements. These commissions then have the power to transform the evidentiary status of oral accounts as they are recorded, written down, and published. This also makes the reports of commissions such interesting documents, since they have both an archival function but also an explanatory or exegetical one, allowing one to see the process through which sense is made from the mass of perhaps contradictory data, how order is produced from disorder, how coherence is produced from incoherence. And again, think of the kinds of hierarchies of thinking that are bound up in these kinds of processes. And we can see this too in the Chalmers report. This was published in 2 volumes. The first volume was 175 pages long and included the legal instruments that established the commission, the main body of the report written by Chalmers, supporting correspondence and documents, as well as the response of Joseph Chamberlain, who was the Secretary of State for the Colonies, which I'll come back to. The much larger second volume comprised 682 pages of mainly oral evidence. These were edited transcripts of interviews with approximately 300 individuals representing different perspectives, from colonial administrators and soldiers to Sierra Leonean members of the colonial service, missionaries, traders, and local chiefs. It's a familiar critique of archives that they are not impartial, but are tools of the powerful, those at the top of the hierarchy. They are filled, of course, with absences and silences, those whose voices and perspectives were perhaps intentionally excluded from the official report, or whose opinions and experiences were not considered worthy of documenting, or who were simply overlooked. But it's also worth remembering that silence can be an act of refusal on the part of those who are dominated in the face of power. It is likely that those most implicated in the insurrection avoided the inquiries of the Commission, and those who were obliged to participate, for instance because they were held in custody, gave little away. Now, I'm slightly conscious of time running away with me, but what I'll try and do is give a little bit more of a kind of off-the-cuff overview of just a particular incident, actually, in this so-called Mendi Uprising, tax war, insurrection. I'll go through it quite quickly, so hopefully you'll be able to make sense of this. It's obviously a complex kind of history. I mean, in some senses, this insurrection was a classic kind of anti-colonial war. It broke out in 1898, just 2 years after the declaration of the Sierra Leonean Protectorate. which changed the structure, of course, of how power, it was a form of indirect rule, if you like, in which British kind of colonial policy was delivered supposedly through the intermediaries of local chiefs who were turned into paramount chiefs. And to fund a program of development, a tax was levied, and this was the so-called hut tax. And this was the thing that sparked this kind of resistance. And the big hero of the hut tax war is this figure, a Temne chief called Bai Beret, and he's celebrated. You'll find him on banknotes and in kind of murals and statuary like this one here. And in fact, the British had a kind of respect for Bai Beret and people like him in the north of the country, where the war really started. It was seen as a kind of a war between military forces, if you like, between combatants. And from a Sierra Leonean point of view, Bai Beret is really celebrated because it shows the kind of the wit and the kind of ability of the Sierra Leonean forces, or the Temne, to resist the British with all their military kind of equipment and so on, through bush tactics, as it were, through spiritual means, as well as being able to operate in a kind of guerrilla warfare style in the forest and so on. What happened was, though, this insurrection spread, and in the April of 1898, actually the 27th of April, which marks the date of Sierra Leone independence, and that's not a coincidence, the south of Sierra Leone, the Mendi-dominated area, uprose as well, and the style of fighting there was very different, and this is seen very much from the colonial perspective as fulfilling stereotypes of savagery and brutality. So this wasn't now a resistance against the military force, but attacks were made on any Europeans, but also on people, traders particularly from Sierra Leone, that's Creole populations from the Crown Colony of Sierra Leone. And these there was widespread attacks on these people and so on. Most notorious on the 3rd of May was the attack on a mission station, an American mission station in a place called Rotifunk, and you can see some pictures here of the of Rotifunk mission station before this attack. And this marked, in a way, a big turning point in the war from the British point of view, particularly because among the missionaries killed were a number of women who were also stripped, and the suggestion is that they were also raped and so on. And you get the most lurid descriptions of these attacks, which partly fabricated, I think, because there were no real witnesses. So there was this kind of imagination employed here. It was a key turning point because this was an outrage, particularly this notion of white women being attacked so savagely by the Mendis. And you can't read this, of course. This is dispatched between the governor of Sierra Leone and the Secretary of State for the colonies in London. And they are basically agreeing together that military resistance or fighting back this insurgency needs to be stepped up. And the main point that they keep coming back to is this murder of the missionary women. And there's a whole other story, of course, to tell about this, because in the American Missionary Association, they were also regarded then as martyrs, which then actually strengthened this mission after this period. I want to just go, though, to the conclusions of the Chalmers report, because Chalmers himself, and it also complicates this notion that the colonial is just one thing. Of course, there were lots of different actors, even from within the colonial administration, if you like. Even a figure like Chalmers, this colonial judge. Because Chalmers, one gets the sense, actually engaged with this large archive of material, the different statements made. And his conclusions were that the insurrection was largely provoked by the British, of course, through the imposition of the way in which colonial rule had been deployed, as it were. He wasn't questioning the right, as it were, of Britain to be a colonial power, so I won't get carried away with him as some kind of anti-colonialist. But as you can read here, that the colonial officers, from the very highest to the lowest subordinate, realised that the subjects of a protectorate have rights. Let government be fixed on principles of justice, not by haphazard opportunism. Let the chiefs be restored to their place in the country. Let wise and sympathetic government be the primary object. So the lessons, as it were, that Chalmers took from the insurrection and the inquiries of the commission was that culpability for this actually lay with the colonial power, and that in a way the resistance, the war, was understandable given the way in which colonial power had been delivered. Just to keep things in check, though, after all of this work, the people who were responsible, as it were, from implementing the recommendations of this commission, that is the governor of Sierra Leone and the colonial secretary, took a very different view. And again, it's interesting to see that the murders of the missionary women, you can see here, are brought out again and again to justify, actually, a much more brutal approach to colonialism. The natural cruelty of the Mendis was exhibited too clearly in the many brutal murders which occurred, and particularly in the murders of the women. The character of a large proportion of the natives is such as to require firm and direct control by the power which undertakes, as I conceive this country has undertaken, to rule them by civilised methods. And in this opinion, I'm confirmed by the nature of the disturbances and outrage on the occasion of the last outbreak. It's a justification from the colonial secretary to basically use a much more strong form of colonial power that treats the natural cruelty and brutality of its subjects in this kind of a way. I'm seeing my time's running out. My journey into this particular story began, it wasn't one of those that started in the archive, it began in the landscape, because actually I mentioned that these missionaries then became kind of martyred, and that was achieved partly through creating a sacred landscape where these attacks had happened. So you can see dotted around Rotterdam these grave markers, or they're not grave markers, they're kind of commemorative markers, where the missionaries were actually killed. And this, of course, was an interesting thing. I kind of began pursuing this and have returned to Rotterdam and gone back to the archive and back to Rotterdam many, many times. And the interesting thing is that one gets an entirely different story about all of this. This isn't about these large kind of colonial stories of the hut tax or about the style of colonial governance and so on. Actually, what was playing out under the chaos of the Mendi uprising was a much more local politics. Okay, and again, I haven't got time to go into this in great depth, but it has to do with different ethnic groups and different displacements. So Temne and Mendi conflict, a group of another ethnic group, the Locos, acting as kind of protectors in this particular chieftaincy. This goes back into the early 19th century. In return for their protection against the Temne from the Mendis, this local group were promised land, and they began to set up their settlement there. Years later, the missionary organisation comes, and they're sold actually the same land that was promised to the loco. And all the time, this man was alive, who in his time, he was a great warrior. Kesebe, he's known, was famous for wearing these protective amulets and so on. Everything was held in check. He died just before the outbreak of the war, and it was his children who sought to revenge this double kind of dealing, as it were, from their hosts. So they were responsible for this this attack, and this is well known locally. None of this is recorded in the commission, of course. So there's a different story, and I just want to end really circling back to the TRC, because actually in my anecdotal inquiries, everywhere I've been in my research, you know, of course there are stories about Ebola outbreak, stories from the Civil War, stories about other kinds of things. And this pattern actually is very familiar from the Civil War, that whilst the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and other things were trying to understand these kind of structural reasons, causes for the conflict and so on, what was being played out was a very local politics. And just to come back to the topic then of the meeting, the Think Lab and so on, and the implications for some of this, for how transitionary justice is kind of performed. You know, there's various stories here. I mean, and partly this is about these hierarchies of voices and ways of knowing, and hierarchies of putting coherence and order above coherence, above things like complexity and disorder. And so this message about learning from yesterday for tomorrow, of course, something like the report of the TRC, it also tried to, it was mandated to create an impartial historical record of the Civil War. But of course, it had another function, which was a symbolic function to mark a transition from a period of conflict to a period of peace. And so the story, the history it had to assemble, had to serve that end. It was no good saying, you know, we need to think complexly about this, there are many people to blame, blah, blah, blah. Blame was put quite firmly on a colonial history. Who would question that? No one. It wasn't placed on any particular local party, I mean, in the overall sense. And it kind of comes back to a much bigger question, in a way, about how these documents, how commissions are kind of written. And the point is often made by historiographers that history is written from the end, as it were, backwards, with a particular telos, with a particular end in mind. And of course, this was the image, as it were, that people were shown as the TRC and the Special Court were operating. This notion of a new tomorrow, a new dawn, a hopeful, a peaceful future. And this was the end point, as it were, that the story, the moral story of the Commission had to arrive at. The question, I suppose, that lingers for me is always, but what about the truth?
Thank you, Paul Basu, for this brilliant talk, which rhymes so well also with the topics that we are having in our network. I would now invite our two discussants to join us here. Professor Susanne Franklin-Sissel, already stepping up here, is the Executive Director of the Center of Conflict Studies at Marburg University. As I mentioned already earlier, this is our lead partner in our research consortium, Hierarchies. She's herself very strongly engaged in issues of transformative justice, so also dealing with that issue of past and present of conflict. And we have Dr. Siddharth Tripathi, who is representing here at the University of Freiburg, further partner in our network, and he's a specialist of non-Western IR, if I may say so, and had several positions, including a senior research fellowship at the Käthe Hamburger Kolleg at University of Freiburg.
Thank you, Andreas, for the introduction, and thank you very much, Paul, for your presentation. I'm actually very excited about the presentation because I think it really fits incredibly well with what we are trying to do or planning to do in our Postcolonial Hierarchies network. 1, 2, I've also first heard your name quite a few years ago, around the time when Eva Ottendorfer was doing her research together with a former PhD student of mine, Friederike Mead, in Sierra Leone, and Friederike already told me about your great work on memory memorials. And when we asked you to come here, I looked at your more current work about restitution and provenance. And I thought, yeah, the work on memory was also very interesting, so I'm really, really pleased you're talking about memory in Sierra Leone today, also because it gives me the opportunity to connect with some of Friederike's work, but also with other work at the Center and some of my knowledge on transitional justice. So let me start, because Siddharth and I, we heard this presentation for the first time, so we're kind of thinking on our feet, and Siddharth has 5 more minutes to organize these notes. So I start. What I really appreciated about your presentation was the content, but also that you linked it to very central concepts of post-colonial thinking, which is temporality, linearity, causality, and dichotomies, or the absence thereof. All of this being features of modernity, kind of achievements in inverted commas of modernity, that are being very much at the foundation of our thinking and epistemologies, but they are not without contestation. And what you illustrate really well with your presentation is how they can be contested when we look at some phenomena. To me, post-colonialism is I use it amongst many things as a tool. It's a way of breaking open kind of almost solid-seeming structures in order to portray how kind of this modern way of looking at things, this modern way of gaze can be contested by looking at the multiple overlapping and entangled legacies of colonialism and how they weave together beyond what first meets the eye. And again, I think your way of dissecting this linearity and temporality and kind of showing multiple voices in the case of Sierra Leone really illustrates that incredibly well. So let me zoom in on some of your topics. I'm not an anthropologist, I'm kind of by heart, but I'm not. I would love to be one, but I'm working with anthropologists, so that helps. And some of the aspects in your presentation kind of resonate with a little bit of what I know about Sierra Leone. So you were talking about kind of the conflating crisis of people who narrate the violent conflict, the civil war in Sierra Leone, and then in relation to Ebola, you were referring to Rosalind Shaw's Timely Sense of Memory, Rothberg's Multi-Direction Memory. The former PhD student Friederike Mead, she did live story interviews, Lebensinterviews, and what she found was that there wasn't so much overlapping in a sense. She felt it was just a long delay of suffering. So something like the Civil War was just one horrible event next to another horrible event next to another horrible event. And what is important, I think, from this insight is that it loses that by looking at, I agree, this is a linear presentation, but by looking at the Civil War in Sierra Leone as one event out of many others in poverty, hunger, Ebola, and so on, it kind of takes away the importance of the Civil War as an event itself. And I think this then is important for transitional justice, because transitional justice is based on the assumption that there is an event that has a beginning and an end. It might have some, its occurrence might have some reasons in the past, but it's something that came and went. But if you are a Sierra Leonean and you feel your life is a crisis from the first to the very last day, this event character is taken away from the Civil War, and it kind of undermines the whole idea of, like, the image you're showing us here with the sunset at the horizon, right? Because people don't quite want to assume that there is something. It's like maybe not in the remit that there is a sun that can ever rise. And this is in Enrique's work very much in the context of severe poverty. Now, on the topic of memory, you already pointed out that the way memorials are designed in Sierra Leone is very much in alliance with what's often referred to as transnational memory. It's kind of in line with a memory boom since the 1990s. We in Germany think that we always have to remember everything, and we have a culture and a tradition of memorials, but on a global scale it's a newer development. So when we now have the impulse after any event worldwide to create a memorial, this is something we do because we happen to be situated in what has been referred to as the memory boom, and we assume that commemorating violence is always the important and right thing to do, and in a particular way as well. So the memory boom doesn't just bring us the kind of imperative to remember, it also brings us particular practices that are deemed to be the right practices. It brings us particular buildings and kind of aesthetics around memorial sites, like you showed in one of the images, also using human remains, which is very highly contested and kind of, I think that's less frequently done now. And there is now a kind of a backlash in a sense because of experiences such as Sierra Leone, where there is more kind of an effort to vernacularize commemoration and memorials, to kind of locate it more into kind of the cultures, traditions and assumptions of the places where the violence actually occurs. However, if we should remember, is not being questioned. So that kind of this demand remains. Kind of it's difficult to imagine a world where we stop building memorials, but maybe they come, maybe they go, maybe it's a paradigm shift at some point, and we don't consider memory to be that important anymore. Difficult to imagine today. Regarding the multiple stories of the reports, in particular you elaborated on the old colonial report. I'm not familiar with, I'm a little bit familiar with the Truth Commission reports, because we ran a project at Marburg University at the Center for Conflict Studies on narrating the truth in truth commissions, with a special focus on sexual violence, and the colleague Anne Menzel has done brilliant work on this. She actually found an archive of the TRC in basically drawers, or it was an archive, but kind of in her assumption, it looked a little bit as if people left their offices, and probably internationals, just took the content of their drawers, emptied it out in a box and pushed it into an archive. So she actually found first drafts of the TRC report with lots of scribbles from people where it says, oh, you can't say this, or you should make this point much more stronger. And Anne Menzel's argument is that it's the international experts that actually determine what kind of truth is being narrated in such a report. It's not so much the voices being collected by these institutions, but it's a very well-meaning crowd, in that particular case, of often females who want to fight against sexual violence during violent conflict. They have an agenda, good agenda as far as I'm concerned, but they then use these reports as ways of communicating that. So in that sense, they're highly political and don't really reflect the voices on the ground. I will end here with my comments, but just to reiterate, I find it really, really helpful and important how you broke down temporality and linearity, and kind of the dichotomies around colonial, post-colonial, war, peace, and kind of the continuation of violence. And yeah, that's me. So I'll hand over to you.
Hello everyone. Thank you, Suzanne, for giving me 5 more minutes to organize my thoughts. Thank you, Paul, for that really fascinating insights. I mean, that's a lot of learning for me because I haven't used that method. So, but I found it really fascinating that this is how things also can be done. And I think we've been discussing a lot of concepts in the morning and the entire day today, and also it will continue tomorrow. And I think they're quite fresh in my memory since we're talking about that. And maybe I will try and organize some of my thoughts based on what we've been discussing, and also linking it to what you presented. It's a very interesting picture which you ended with. I was just thinking that what if, if we reverse this idea of linearity and time, and we think that this is how things might have been before colonialism, and then everything changed after that, then completely changes the perspective. And why I'm saying that is, following from what I think John Berger talks about in Ways of Seeing, where he says that what is involved in seeing and how the way we see things is determined by what we know. So that something already shapes, how we see things, and talking about the whole politics of visuality and what we see, right? So, I do feel that there's a lot to learn from yesterday for a better tomorrow, as was mentioned in the first sort of on the first page of the report. But what I also feel is that we need to learn a lot or unlearn a lot in the light of our own entanglements and embeddedness in the coloniality of knowledge production. So when we talk about the truth, when you ended with the truth, I'm not from Sierra Leone, Suzanne is not from there, and nobody here is. So it also brings our own sort of entanglements, our own positioning, and I'm sort of a bit uncomfortable here in terms of talking about these things. But that's, I guess, my own sort of struggles with my own positionality. So ideally, it would have been somebody from Sierra Leone and talking about that. But I can understand there are different constraints on those things, So, but the second point is again, talk about coloniality, and Suzanne also talked about how you sort of very nicely talked about spatiality and temporality, and it's fascinating for me to look at these interlinkages, that existed about the linearity of time, where it's a very linear understanding, and in so many cultures, time is not linear. There's a cyclical sort of understanding of time, and it also links to this whole idea of space. Where when you talked about the sites which were presented there, it's a very sort of European understanding of center, and then everything builds around that. Whereas, at least I can talk about India and how I've seen things there. There's no center; there are multiple centers, right? And that's how things evolve. So even in this, it was very interesting to see that how that logic of organization in terms of the space and the time works, and is also seen in those things. The third is about continuity and discontinuity. Following from this whole idea of time. When you were talking about, I was at least I managed to read some of the lines from the report. It was very interesting to see how the other was sort of categorized, but it's interesting to see such sort of historical work and apply it to the present context. I think in the morning Manuela was talking about looking at history in that sense, and I just couldn't sort of stop but think about how certain, say, black and brown men are looked upon here, say in Europe, where they are the other and they come here to take away our woman. That's the sort of some of the narratives which I have seen, right? And it's the whole thing about the civilized versus the uncivilized, and this whole idea of, I think there was a quote where it talked about rule them by civilized methods, and also in the report, what I think you did not underline, what I found was also fascinating was, there's this nice, or at least partially nice white man who talks about nice things, but one thing which I found was interesting was that they'll also provide revenue for all the needs that will follow. So of course there's an economic sort of logic to that, so to this whole thing. So it's interesting for me to sort of look at these continuities, discontinuities, but also visual sort of matrix of coloniality and how it actually produces. The last point what I think about is So when you talk about reparations and others, we are talking about the decolonization of the sort of act as such, right? Does it automatically translate into decoloniality and decolonization of the ideas in terms of the hierarchies that we're trying to contest and deal with ourselves? Or what is your experience on that? So yeah, coming back to truth, I mean, what is truth? I mean, I would like to sort of, understand that, and then also who speaks for whom. Thank you.
Thank you first very much to both for your response to the paper and then for these questions. I mean, these are all difficult questions. So I mean, they're kind of starting points for a deliberation, I think, together. So I won't pretend to have answers at my fingertips, because in a way it's a question of asking, well, what's the consequence of this? And I suppose it's easy just to say, well, it's about reconfiguring the whole basis on which we do things. But that's kind of what we're asking for, isn't it, in a kind of a decolonial term. We're not talking about kind of tinkering with the kind of bits and pieces on the surface. We're actually looking at really underlying assumptions. It's an ontological space, it's an epistemological space. So I find it challenging then to think, oh well, if we just then tweak this, then that will be all right then, because it seems that we actually need to reimagine things rather fundamentally, and I think just that last question there about the legitimate forms of who legitimately holds violence, for instance, in these kinds of contexts. I mean, I think that, the case in a way from the 19th century showed that unquestioning that, the colonial power had the legitimacy of violence because this is a civilization based, this is a civilizationary process and so on, and this barbarism had to be, removed. There was an unquestioned legitimacy, that supported that, So whilst we, think of that as being in another paradigm, I guess we're confronted with thinking, what does that mean then? Because we're still aware of these kinds of claims to legitimacy that support the intervention in all kinds of different things. And, Suzanne, you mentioned the case of kind of gendered violence and so on. Absolutely. So I guess who is the arbiter of these things? You mentioned this, the kinds of people who are invested in this and are kind of shaping these narratives and so on in those kinds of processes. And it's not an easy thing to simply say, well, this is wrong, because we might be convinced of the reason. We are hoping ultimately somehow for a better future, all of us. And yet, how do we disentangle that from this legitimization of certain forms of power? So yeah, I mean, it's, as with many kind of things, it's easy, as an anthropologist perhaps especially, it's easy to kind of try and poke at the problem and to ask the questions, to then translate that into a policy approach is, I think, a much harder thing because of that kind of fundamentality of it. Siddharth, you mentioned this question, which is a really big question for me about, who can speak for whom, and I really struggle with this, because it's not so much that belief, that, if I was Sierra Leonean, I would feel much more confident in being able to present this, but I suppose it's that vision of, it's an anti-cosmopolitan vision of the world where we can only speak for, and there's a million cartoons which show this, how far do you go in terms of representing yourself? Can I represent my family? Can I represent my town? Can I represent my country? Can I represent my colour, whatever that might be? How do we decide that? I mean, a lot of my work is based in West Africa. I myself, Basu, I'm a come from, my father's from India, my mother's English, and I find this quite a privileged position, and you know, more of your narrative of dark-skinned men and light-skinned women there, but that point of questioning, you know, the inability to point to a map and say, well, that's where I belong, that's for whom I can speak, I think is, you know, is actually a powerful one, because if we actually all think about this and think of the deeper human history, we're all ultimately, you know, from somewhere else. So I think it's a challenging thing, and I don't think I could come up with a glib answer to that and think, well, I can only speak for Chelsfield in Kent, which is where I grew up. You know, so what I think we need to do is to be mindful of the positionality and mindful of our kind of power in relations in those respects. But I think, again, it's one of those things that needs to just keep troubling us rather than think that we're going to get to a point where we can suddenly resolve this, because it seems to me a very negative space to then go into. It would be one of my visions of the sunny horizon, which is absurd, by the way, in Sierra Leone, because Sierra Leone points west, so that would be a sunset, of course. Sorry, just kind of going through some of the other notes there. I think, again, you know, Samson's point, you know, I found this many times as well. I mentioned that I often take these kind of colonial records back to communities, and sometimes, I mean, it's complex, because sometimes those maps have problematic knowledge, because this is, history really matters, and you know, these kind of land questions and boundary disputes and so on are very much alive, and I think that was the broader point I was trying to come at, and this is part of the point of decoloniality, as I understand it too, is that these things are not, you know, past, these are very present, and so these histories and the politics that surround them are very present. How to resolve that? Again, I think it's a really challenging question, and I'm tempted to say, you sit down, you understand the history that produced these documents, but, you know, perhaps that's just going back into the same kind of cycle that we're talking about. The only thing I'd say otherwise, though, is that it's not as if this began with colonialism. So I can't remember who mentioned this looking backwards and so on. Because that's precisely what the TRC in Sierra Leone did, is it imagined a pre-colonial idyll, you know, of peaceful coexistence, everything was wonderful, that it got interrupted. So this is a bit like you were saying with the conflict itself, it's an event, you know, with a beginning and end. So in this logic of the TRC, colonialism is an event, you know, that began with, you know, the Portuguese turning up on the coast in the late 15th century, and then ended in 1961, or at least that's when it turned into neo-colonialism. So, you know, but it's also a very patronising view to think, you know, power, hierarchy, all of these things, of course, didn't exist before colonialism, and so on. So, the point is that there's always something to deploy in contestation, you know. So the colonial map becomes a useful tool also. So is it the map's fault, I suppose is the question, or is the map being used, as it were, in that politics, and maybe it had been where that tree was, or where that stone was, or what have you, or where that lineage came from, or something like that. There might have been another thing to pin the dispute on, as it were, because I think we can say that the disputes have probably been there all along.